I had just reached for the empty chair at the end of the table when my daughter-in-law snapped her fingers at the security guard and said, loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear, "Get this pauper away from the table." For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. The clink of silverware faded, conversations stalled mid-sentence, and every head within 20 feet slowly turned in our direction. I stood there beside the polished oak table, still holding my purse in both hands, as if I had simply walked into the wrong place. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, and that night was supposed to be a simple family dinner. I remember thinking how strange it was that Vanessa had chosen a restaurant like that for a family gathering. The place sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, the kind of restaurant where the windows glowed warm against the evening street, and the host wore a dark vest and tie. Inside, soft jazz floated through the room, and the lights were dim enough to make every table feel private. I had almost turned around at the door because my shoes suddenly felt too ordinary for the carpeted floor. But Ethan had texted earlier that afternoon, "Mom, tonight will be special. Don't be late." So I went in with a small box wrapped in silver paper and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, things between us were changing. Ethan was already seated when I arrived. My son is 41 now, tall like his father, with the same thoughtful eyes he had as a boy. When he was little, he used to run down the driveway every afternoon the second he heard my car. That memory still visits me sometimes, like sunlight through a window that no longer exists. But that night, when I stepped up to the table, Ethan didn't stand. He didn't even look surprised to see me there. He just glanced briefly in my direction, then back down at the glass of water in front of him. Vanessa sat beside him, perfectly composed, wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than the monthly rent on my small apartment. Her posture was straight, her chin slightly lifted, the way people sit when they are certain the room belongs to them. Around the table were a few other relatives and 2 of Ethan's business associates. Everyone had already ordered drinks. I noticed there wasn't a chair set for me. I assumed it was just a mistake. I smiled politely and reached for the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one slightly pulled away from the others, when Vanessa leaned back in her seat and looked at me as though I had wandered into the wrong house. Her eyes traveled slowly over my coat, my shoes, my purse. Then she turned toward the security guard standing near the bar and raised her hand. The gesture was casual, almost bored, like someone calling a waiter to refill a glass. That was when she said it. "Get this pauper away from the table." The words didn't come out as anger. They came out smooth, polished, deliberate. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above us and the low murmur of a couple at the next table who had suddenly gone silent. The guard hesitated, looking from her to me and then to Ethan, as if waiting for someone to clarify that this was all some strange misunderstanding. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't stand up. He didn't even meet my eyes. Instead, he reached for his glass and took a slow sip of water. I remember the way the ice shifted inside the glass. Such a small sound. Such a loud moment. I stood there for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were, looking at the table where my own son sat among people who now watched me like I was an inconvenience. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, I realized something important. This dinner had never been meant for me. I did not argue with the guard. I did not raise my voice or defend myself the way some people might have expected. Instead, I simply nodded once, the same quiet nod I used to give Ethan when he was a boy and refused to wear a coat on a cold morning. The guard looked uncomfortable as he stepped closer to me, but he spoke politely, almost apologetically, asking if I would come with him toward the entrance. I told him that it was all right. My voice sounded calm even to my own ears, which surprised me. I turned once before leaving the table. Ethan was still, staring down at his glass. Vanessa had already resumed her conversation with one of the guests as though nothing unusual had happened. A few people watched me with awkward curiosity. Others quickly looked away. The guard walked beside me across the dining room. The restaurant lights reflected softly off the polished floor, and the quiet music continued as if the world had decided not to notice what had just taken place. When we reached the front door, he stopped and said quietly that he was sorry. I told him there was no reason for him to apologize. He was only doing the job someone else had asked him to do. Outside, the air felt cooler than I expected. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees along Maple Street, and for a moment I stood there on the sidewalk watching the warm glow from the restaurant windows. Through the glass, I could see the table where Ethan and Vanessa were sitting. From a distance, it looked like any other pleasant dinner among family and friends. No one passing by would have known that the woman standing alone on the sidewalk had been asked to leave. I began walking toward the small parking lot behind the building. My car was parked under a street lamp that flickered softly above the asphalt. As I walked, I noticed that I was still holding the silver-wrapped box I had brought with me. I had chosen that gift earlier in the afternoon while standing in a small shop near my apartment. It was nothing extravagant, just a simple antique compass inside a wooden case. Ethan had loved maps when he was a child. He used to spread them across the living room floor and imagine road trips across the country. I had thought he might smile when he saw it. I unlocked my car and sat down behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. The silence inside the car felt heavy, but not unbearable. I placed the small box carefully on the passenger seat beside me. Then I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. The truth was that this dinner had not surprised me as much as it probably should have. Moments like that rarely appear out of nowhere. They grow slowly, quietly, over years. Little comments that seem harmless at first. Invitations that never arrive. Conversations that end when you enter the room. I had noticed the changes long before that night. Vanessa had always been polite in the beginning. Polite in the careful way someone is polite when they are studying you rather than welcoming you. Over time, her tone had sharpened. Small remarks about money. Gentle jokes about my apartment. Suggestions that I might be happier living somewhere smaller or quieter. Ethan never corrected her. At first, he would laugh awkwardly and change the subject. Later, he simply remained silent. The hardest part was not the words themselves. It was the silence that followed them. I opened my eyes and looked again toward the restaurant. From where I sat, I could see the silhouettes of people moving past the windows. The dinner was continuing without interruption. I realized then that Vanessa had not created that moment alone. She had only revealed something that had already been true for a long time. That table inside the restaurant had never really had a place for me anymore. And perhaps the most painful part of that realization was understanding that my own son had known it long before I did. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes without turning the key. The small wooden box with the compass rested quietly on the passenger seat, its silver wrapping catching the dim light from the street lamp above. For a long time I simply looked at it, remembering the afternoon I bought it. The shop owner had wrapped it carefully while telling me how the compass was made in Vermont by a craftsman who still believed tools should last longer than the people who used them. I had smiled when he said that. Ethan used to love things like that when he was younger. When he was 10 years old, he once spread an old road atlas across our kitchen table and traced routes with a red marker, planning imaginary trips from Maine to California. Back then he used to say that every family needed a direction, the way every traveler needed a compass. I remember laughing at how serious he sounded for such a small boy. That memory stayed with me as I reached for the steering wheel and finally started the engine. The car hummed softly, and for a moment I watched the reflection of the restaurant lights in my rearview mirror. People inside were still eating, still talking, still enjoying a dinner that had never included me. I pulled slowly out of the parking space and turned onto Maple Street. The drive back to my apartment took about 20 minutes, though that night it felt longer. The road passed through familiar blocks lined with quiet houses and tall maple trees that rustled gently in the evening wind. A few porch lights glowed warmly along the sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and then fell silent. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary streets. Life moving forward as it always did. When I stopped at a red light near the old pharmacy on Oak Avenue, another memory surfaced without warning. It was from the first time Ethan introduced Vanessa to me. They had come over for Sunday dinner almost 12 years earlier. Vanessa arrived carrying a beautiful bouquet of white lilies and a bottle of wine that looked far too expensive for a casual meal. She smiled easily that evening and asked thoughtful questions about Ethan's childhood. I remember thinking how confident she seemed, how comfortable she was speaking about her plans and ambitions. At the end of dinner, she had helped me clear the table and said that family meant everything to her. At the time, I believed her. Over the years, that smile had changed. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic way. It had shifted slowly, like a photograph fading under sunlight. Compliments became observations. Observations became quiet judgments. I began noticing the way she looked at my small car when I arrived at their house, the way she commented on how expensive the neighborhood had become, the way she sometimes joked that Ethan worried too much about helping me when he should focus on building his future. None of those comments were harsh on their own. They were simply small things, the kind people brush aside because they want peace inside their family. I brushed them aside too. The traffic light turned green and I continued driving, passing the grocery store where Ethan and I used to shop together every Saturday morning when he was in middle school. He used to push the cart down the aisles while reading labels out loud and asking endless questions about everything from cereal ingredients to where oranges came from. Those were good years. Simple years. Years when the idea of my son sitting quietly while someone called his mother a pauper would have been unimaginable. By the time I reached my apartment complex, the sky had darkened completely. The building stood quietly at the end of a small street lined with elm trees. I parked in my usual space near the entrance and turned off the engine. For a moment I remained seated, listening to the soft ticking sound the car made as it cooled. Then I picked up the small box from the passenger seat. The silver wrapping paper had a faint crease now where my fingers had pressed it earlier in the evening. I turned it slowly in my hands and realized something that had not fully settled in my mind until that moment. The humiliation at the restaurant had not been the beginning of the story. It had only been the moment when everything that had been quietly building for years finally revealed itself in front of witnesses. And once something like that is revealed, it becomes impossible to pretend that nothing has changed. I carried the small silver-wrapped box upstairs to my apartment and set it on the kitchen table beside the lamp that has been there for almost 20 years. The light cast a soft circle across the wood surface, and for a while I simply stood there looking at the box the same way someone might look at an old photograph. My apartment is not large, but it is quiet and comfortable. A narrow hallway leads from the front door into a small living room where two bookshelves sit against the wall beside a window that overlooks the street. The kitchen table is round and worn from years of use. When Ethan was younger, he used to sit there doing his homework while I cooked dinner. Sometimes he would spin slowly in the chair while asking questions about the world, about school, about what kind of person he might become one day. Those were the years when the future still felt open and generous. I removed my coat and hung it on the hook by the door before returning to the table. The box remained exactly where I had left it. The silver paper looked almost too bright for the quiet room, like something meant for celebration that had lost its moment. I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. For several minutes I did not move. Instead, I listened to the faint sounds of the building around me. Somewhere down the hallway a television was playing softly. A faucet turned on in the apartment above mine. Ordinary sounds that reminded me how the world continues forward even when something inside your own life has shifted. Eventually I reached forward and opened the small wooden case inside the wrapping. The compass rested in the center on a dark felt cushion, its brass surface polished and steady. The needle trembled gently before settling into place, pointing north with quiet certainty. I remembered the words the shop owner had spoken earlier that day. A good compass always finds its direction no matter where you carry it. I turned the instrument slowly between my fingers and felt a strange sense of calm begin to replace the confusion that had followed me home. The humiliation at the restaurant had been sharp, but it had also been clear. There was no misunderstanding about what Vanessa believed. There was no uncertainty about the way Ethan had chosen to respond. In a strange way, clarity can feel like a form of relief. When you finally see something for what it truly is, you stop wasting energy pretending it might become something else. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf in the living room where a framed photograph rested between two rows of old travel guides. The picture showed Ethan at the age of 8 standing beside his father on a hiking trail in Colorado. They were both wearing red jackets and wide smiles. Ethan had insisted on carrying the map that day even though the trail was clearly marked. His father used to say that our son had an instinct for finding his way. I looked at that photograph for a long time before setting the compass down beside it on the shelf. Then I returned to the kitchen table and sat again, folding my hands quietly in front of me. What happened that evening at the restaurant had not been an accident. Vanessa had chosen the moment carefully. She had chosen the audience. She had chosen the words. But what she had not realized was that humiliation does not always weaken the person it is meant to hurt. Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it removes the last layer of illusion that has been protecting others from the consequences of their choices. As I sat there in the soft light of my apartment, I began to think back through the years with a different kind of attention, noticing details I had once ignored. The way Vanessa had slowly shaped conversations about money. The way she had guided Ethan away from family gatherings that did not benefit her plans. The way certain financial discussions had always ended with her reassuring smile and Ethan's quiet agreement. Those memories arranged themselves in my mind like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. And for the first time since leaving the restaurant, I realized that the story Vanessa believed she had written for me might not end the way she expected. I remained at the kitchen table long after midnight, the compass resting on the shelf behind me and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room. When the clock on the microwave turned to 12:30, I finally stood up and walked toward the small desk near the living room window where I keep a narrow wooden drawer filled with documents and old envelopes. I had not opened that drawer in several months. Life has a way of placing certain papers out of sight when you believe you will not need them again. I pulled the drawer open slowly and began sorting through the folders inside. Bank statements, property tax receipts, insurance forms. Beneath them all rested a thicker envelope with my late husband Daniel's handwriting still visible across the front. Seeing his name written in that familiar, careful script made me pause. Daniel Collins had believed in preparation the same way some people believe in luck. During the last year of his life, he had insisted on organizing everything with quiet patience. I remember him sitting at this very desk one Sunday afternoon with a stack of papers spread neatly across the surface while sunlight came through the window behind him. At the time, I thought he was simply being thorough. Now I understood he had been building something more lasting than either of us had realized. I carried the envelope back to the kitchen table and sat down again. The paper felt slightly worn along the edges as I opened it and spread the contents in front of me. There were copies of property records, a few letters from his attorney, and several documents I had not examined closely before. One in particular caught my attention immediately. It was dated 3 years before Daniel passed away and bore the official seal of a legal office in downtown Hartford. I read the page once. Then I read it again more carefully. The document described a trust arrangement Daniel had established for the house we had owned for most of our marriage, as well as a number of financial accounts that had grown quietly over decades of disciplined saving. I felt a slow breath leave my chest as the meaning settled in. The trust had been placed entirely under my control with specific instructions regarding how its assets could be used and who could access them in the future. Ethan's name appeared in the document as a potential beneficiary one day, but only under certain conditions that were clearly written in Daniel's careful language. Those conditions required cooperation, respect, and a willingness to maintain family stability. Daniel had always believed that wealth without responsibility could damage a person's character. At the time, those words had sounded philosophical. Now they felt almost prophetic. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the quiet apartment again. Vanessa had believed that I was a woman with no resources. A woman who depended on the goodwill of others to maintain a place at the table. That belief had clearly guided the confidence with which she had spoken at the restaurant earlier that evening. What she had not known was that Daniel had quietly arranged our lives so that no one would ever have the power to erase me from the story we built together. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them back into the envelope before resting my hands on the table. Outside the window, the street lamp illuminated the empty sidewalk in a pale yellow glow. Somewhere a car passed slowly through the intersection and disappeared into the night. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, I felt something stronger than disappointment settling into my thoughts. It was not anger. It was not revenge. It was clarity. Vanessa had revealed her intentions in front of witnesses. Ethan had revealed his silence in front of those same witnesses. And now, sitting in the quiet of my apartment with Daniel's careful planning laid out before me, I understood something with absolute certainty. The evening at that restaurant had not been the moment when I lost my place at the table. It had been the moment when the real balance of power quietly began to change. I slept only a few hours that night, but when morning arrived, I felt a calm steadiness that had not been there the evening before. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window stretched across the table where Daniel's envelope still rested beside my coffee cup. For a moment, I simply watched the light move slowly across the wood surface. Life has a way of looking ordinary, even when something inside you has quietly shifted. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down again, opening the envelope once more and reviewing the documents carefully, this time with a clearer mind. Daniel had always believed that preparation should be done quietly and without drama. He used to say that true security is invisible until the moment it becomes necessary. As I read through the pages again, I began noticing details that had escaped my attention the night before. The trust was not only connected to the house we once owned together. It also included a modest but carefully structured investment account Daniel had built over many years. The document described exactly how the funds could be used, who had authority over them, and what conditions had to be met before anyone else could gain access. My name appeared repeatedly as the sole decision maker. Ethan's name appeared only as a future beneficiary, and even then the language was precise. The conditions required mutual respect between family members and clear cooperation with the trustee. Daniel had even included a handwritten note at the bottom of one page, something his attorney must have allowed as a personal addition. Margaret will always know what is right for this family. I ran my finger gently along that sentence before closing the folder again. The confidence in his words felt almost like a conversation reaching across time. After finishing my coffee, I dressed slowly and placed the envelope inside my leather briefcase, the same one I used to carry when I worked part-time at the community library several years ago. I had not used that briefcase in a long time, but it felt appropriate somehow. Around 10 in the morning, I left my apartment and drove toward the center of town. The streets were busy with ordinary weekday activity. Parents walking children to school. Delivery trucks pulling into storefronts. A man watering the flower boxes outside a small bakery on the corner of Pine Street. Everything looked exactly the way it always had, which made the quiet determination growing inside me feel almost private. I parked near the brick building where Daniel's attorney still maintained his office. The sign on the door read Harper and Lowell Legal Services, the same name that had appeared on the documents in the envelope. When I stepped inside, the receptionist looked up from her desk and smiled politely. I told her my name and explained that I had once worked with Mr. Harper years ago regarding my husband's estate planning. She checked a calendar on her computer before telling me that Mr. Harper was still with the firm and had a brief opening later that morning. I took a seat in the waiting area and folded my hands in my lap. The office smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Framed photographs of the town from decades ago hung along the walls. While I waited, I found myself thinking again about the dinner at the restaurant and Vanessa's confident voice calling for security. At the time, her certainty had seemed absolute. She had believed she understood the full measure of my circumstances. She had believed she was removing someone who no longer belonged at her table. Yet sitting there in that quiet office, I understood something she had not considered. Power does not always appear in the way people expect. Sometimes it waits quietly in a drawer, inside an envelope, written in careful language by someone who understood the future better than anyone else in the room. And for the first time since leaving the restaurant the night before, I allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile as I realized that the next chapter of this story would not unfold the way Vanessa Collins had imagined. I sat in the waiting chair of Harper and Lowell Legal Services with the envelope resting quietly inside my briefcase, my hands folded in my lap as the morning moved forward around me. The office was calm in the way places of long practice often are. Papers were stacked neatly on desks. Phones rang softly and were answered in steady voices. Somewhere down the hallway, I could hear the faint sound of a printer running. After a few minutes, the receptionist stood and walked toward me with a polite smile, and said that Mr. Harper would see me now. I followed her down a narrow hallway lined with framed certificates and photographs of the town taken decades ago when the streets looked wider and the storefront signs were painted by hand. Mr. Harper stood up when I entered his office. He was older than the last time I had seen him, but his expression carried the same careful attention I remembered from years before. "Margaret Collins," he said, extending his hand warmly. "It has been quite some time." I returned the greeting and took the seat across from his desk before placing the envelope in front of him. I explained briefly that I had come across the documents Daniel had prepared several years earlier and wanted to review the details with him to make certain I understood everything correctly. Mr. Harper opened the envelope slowly and began examining the pages one by one. As he read, his expression shifted slightly into the thoughtful focus of someone revisiting familiar material. "Yes," he said after a few moments, "your husband was very thorough. We spent several weeks structuring this trust to ensure it would remain stable regardless of changes in family circumstances." He turned the document toward me and pointed to several sections written in formal language. These provisions give you full authority over the property and the financial accounts attached to the trust. No one can alter those terms without your consent. I listened carefully as he continued explaining the details. The trust included the house Daniel and I had owned for 30 years before I sold it after his passing. It also held investments that had quietly grown over time. The most important section, however, described the conditions Daniel had placed on Ethan's potential inheritance. Mr. Harper tapped that paragraph gently with his pen. Your husband believed strongly that family cooperation was essential before any assets would transfer. If those conditions are not met, the trust remains under your direction indefinitely. His words settled into the quiet room with a weight that felt both reassuring and bittersweet. I asked a few practical questions about what those conditions meant in real terms and how the trust might be adjusted if circumstances required it. Mr. Harper answered each question with patient clarity. At one point he leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me for a moment before speaking again. Margaret, I remember Daniel saying something very specific when we finalized this agreement. He said that you understood people better than he did and that you would always know when the time was right to act. Hearing that memory spoken aloud brought an unexpected warmth to my chest. Daniel had always trusted my judgment, even in moments when I doubted it myself. I gathered the documents back into the envelope and placed them once more inside my briefcase before standing to leave. As I walked back through the reception area, the sunlight from the front windows stretched across the polished floor. Outside the building, the town looked exactly as it had when I arrived that morning. Cars moved steadily along the street. A man carried a box of fresh produce into the cafe across the road. Ordinary life continuing without interruption. Yet as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt something inside me settle into place with quiet certainty. Vanessa Collins believed she had revealed my place in the world the night before. She believed she had defined who belonged at her table and who did not. But as I walked toward my car with Daniel's careful plans resting inside my briefcase, I understood something she had not yet discovered. The story she thought she had ended in that restaurant was only beginning to reveal its true direction. I drove slowly through the center of town after leaving the attorney's office, the briefcase resting on the passenger seat beside me as if it carried a quiet weight of its own. The sky had cleared into a bright afternoon blue and the streets looked exactly the way they always had on a weekday. People walked in and out of small shops. A delivery truck stopped in front of the grocery store. Two teenagers crossed the street laughing about something on a phone screen. Everything appeared normal, which made the calm clarity forming in my mind feel even sharper. I did not feel angry as I drove. Anger burns too quickly and leaves people careless. What I felt instead was patience. Daniel used to say that patience is simply confidence that time will reveal what people truly are. When I reached my apartment building, I carried the briefcase upstairs and placed it carefully on the kitchen table beside the compass that now rested near the window. The brass needle pointed steadily north as it had the night before. I opened the briefcase again and removed the documents Mr. Harper had reviewed with me earlier that morning. Seeing the legal language in the daylight of my own home made everything feel more real, more grounded. Vanessa believed that wealth was something you could recognize immediately. She believed it appeared in designer clothing, expensive restaurants, and the confident tone of someone who believed they controlled the room. What she had never understood was that real security often lives quietly in decisions made years earlier by people who cared more about stability than appearance. Daniel had never liked showing off what he had built. He believed that dignity was stronger when it did not need an audience. As I placed the papers back into the envelope, I found myself remembering the early years of our marriage when money had been tight and every dollar mattered. We had lived in a small 2-bedroom house outside Hartford and spent weekends repairing things ourselves instead of paying someone else to do it. Ethan used to sit on the front steps with a glass of lemonade while Daniel worked in the yard and I painted the wooden fence. Those were the years when our family learned what effort looked like. Vanessa had never seen that part of the story. She had entered Ethan's life when the difficult years were already behind us, and the stability Daniel created had quietly taken root. I closed the envelope and placed it inside the drawer of the desk near the window. Then I returned to the kitchen table and looked again at the compass resting in its wooden case. A direction does not shout. It simply remains steady until someone chooses to follow it. Later that afternoon, my phone vibrated softly on the table. The screen showed Ethan's name. For a moment, I considered letting the call pass unanswered, but instead I picked up the phone and listened to the sound of his voice on the other end. He spoke carefully, almost awkwardly, explaining that the dinner the night before had been misunderstood and that Vanessa might have spoken too quickly. His tone carried the uncertain politeness of someone trying to smooth over an uncomfortable moment without truly examining what had happened. I did not argue with him. I simply listened and answered with calm sentences that gave him nothing to resist. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly for a few seconds. Vanessa believed the restaurant had been the moment when she defined my place in the family. Ethan believed that time would soften the memory until it disappeared. But sitting there in the quiet light of my apartment with Daniel's careful planning resting only a few feet away, I understood something neither of them had considered. Some moments do not fade with time. Some moments reveal the truth so clearly that every decision afterward must follow a new direction. I woke the next morning before the sun had fully risen, the quiet light of dawn slowly filling the small apartment as the city outside began to stir. For a few moments I remained seated at the kitchen table with a warm cup of coffee between my hands, watching the pale gold light stretch across the wooden surface where the compass rested in its open case. The brass needle remained steady, pointing north with the same calm certainty it had shown every time I looked at it. It occurred to me then that direction is not something that argues or forces itself into attention. It simply waits for the moment when someone is ready to recognize it. The events at the restaurant 2 nights earlier had already begun to feel distant, not because the memory had faded, but because my understanding of it had changed. What Vanessa believed had been a demonstration of power was in reality only a revelation of character. She had shown the entire table exactly who she was willing to become in order to feel important. And Ethan, by remaining silent, had revealed the quiet compromise he had made with that behavior. Later that morning, I took the envelope from the desk drawer once more and placed it carefully inside my briefcase before leaving the apartment. The drive across town felt almost peaceful. The sky was clear, and the streets carried the calm rhythm of an ordinary weekday. I stopped briefly at the small bakery on Pine Street where the owner had known Daniel for years. The smell of fresh bread filled the air while sunlight warmed the front windows. I ordered a simple cup of coffee and sat near the window for a few minutes, watching people pass along the sidewalk. Families moved through their routines. Office workers hurried toward their jobs. No one looking at me would have known that the direction of my own life had shifted quietly over the past 48 hours. When I finished my coffee, I walked outside and continued toward the parking lot where my car waited. As I opened the door, my phone vibrated again in my purse. Ethan's name appeared on the screen for the second time since our conversation the day before. I answered calmly. His voice sounded different this time, less certain, as though the distance of a day had allowed the memory of that dinner to settle more clearly in his mind. He said that Vanessa wanted to invite me to another dinner the following week, a chance to start fresh and leave the uncomfortable moment behind. I listened without interrupting and then answered gently that I appreciated the invitation, but that some things cannot simply be reset like a misplaced appointment on a calendar. I explained that Daniel had spent many years building stability for our family, and that stability depended on respect as much as affection. My voice remained calm and steady while I spoke. There was no need for anger. Truth rarely requires it. When the call ended, I placed the phone back into my purse and sat quietly in the car for a moment before starting the engine. The envelope inside the briefcase rested beside me, silent but certain. Vanessa believed she had defined my place in the family when she called for security in that restaurant. She believed that wealth, authority, and belonging were measured by the loudness of a voice or the confidence of a gesture. But as the engine hummed softly and the morning sun rose higher above the buildings of the town Daniel and I had spent our lives in, I understood something she had not yet realized. The true direction of a family is not decided at the table where someone is humiliated. It is decided long before that moment by the character of the people who built the foundation beneath it. And when the time comes to protect that foundation, the quiet decisions made in calm rooms often carry more power than the loudest words spoken in public.